Hello and welcome to the session on 24/7 carbon-free energy. We're going to be focusing on accelerating grid decarbonisation through corporate energy procurement strategies. First of all, a big thank you to Google, who are powering this session. My name is Bruce Douglas, the Director of Business and Communications at Eurelectric. This session is an opportunity to discuss the recent and growing interest among corporate companies to develop clean energy procurement strategies that accelerate decarbonisation. The session is dedicated to 24/7 clean energy matching and will include an introduction by Google and then a panel discussion among expert speakers. Renewable electricity sourcing is core to corporate decarbonisation strategies. Companies are already accelerating their transition towards 100% renewable electricity in line with European climate commitments. And Europe is also increasing its CO2 ambitions to reduce by at least 55% by 2030, on the path to carbon neutrality by 2050, which raises the bar significantly in a short 10-year period. Many companies have already met or are on their way to meeting their total electricity consumption with renewables on an average annual basis. They're using a combination of PPAs bundled with GOs, so guarantees of origin, behind-the-meter installations on site, and unbundled GO purchases. However, forward-thinking companies are now seeking to evolve their clean energy procurement strategies to maximize their decarbonisation impact on the grid. More clean energy buyers are revising their ambitions upward, aiming to match their clean energy procurement with their consumption on at least an hourly basis. The potential benefits for moving towards 24/7 carbon-free energy matching are firstly accelerating the decarbonisation of grids by supporting the development of clean energy, increasing credibility of corporate sustainability claims and accuracy of carbon accounting, and finally, facilitating new business models and innovative technologies. Now, while the market for this ambitious 24/7 matching strategy is still in its infancy, it is expected to grow. It will anticipate the challenges associated with the decarbonisation of the entire electricity grid. Ultimately, all customers and suppliers will have to follow the path towards matching fully decarbonised supply and demand. Discussing the challenges and opportunities associated with this evolving strategy at company level paves the way to face the same challenges for all electricity consumers. This will allow all stakeholders to prepare themselves step by step for what the future holds and have an increasingly positive impact on decarbonisation. To successfully transition towards 24/7 carbon-free energy, it will be crucial to rethink electricity markets, grids, products, and certification systems to achieve a faster and more cost-effective grid-wide decarbonisation. We must also leverage digital solutions, demand-side management, storage, trading systems, carbon accounting, auditing, and more. At the same time, corporates will need to be able to monitor and certify their real-time clean electricity matching. All solutions must be compatible and ideally harmonized within European and other electricity markets. So, let's dive straight in, and I'm delighted to firstly introduce one of, if not the most progressive corporate energy buyers. It's an honor to have the Principal for Energy and Global Infrastructure at Google joining us today from the US, Amanda Peterson-Correo. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I'm really looking forward to having a rich panel discussion about 24/7. But before we jump into the panel, I thought it would be helpful if we had a quick discussion on what we're actually talking about here to introduce the panel. What is 24/7? What does it actually mean? How do we get here? And how does it actually apply in practice on how we're thinking about doing things differently than maybe other goals or standards as we think about it? So to go back, to start, it's helpful to understand how we got here, is to understand what the last decade has really looked like. And I lay this in a context of of really thinking about what we're trying to do here. So, speaking on behalf of Google, in 2010, we did our first corporate PPA. And to understand why we did that, it was really for two reasons. We were already a carbon neutral company, which meant we bought high quality carbon offsets to match our carbon footprint at the time, but we wanted to have greater impact. And the corporate PPA allowed us to add more additional green energy to the grid. But it was also one of the few things we could do back in 2010 as an end user. And we really wanted to send a signal to the market that, hey, your customers want a decarbonized grid. We really want clean energy. It was 2 years later that we set our goal to be 100% matched annually with renewable energy. And it took the last decade to get there. And I think what's really interesting is at that time, there, it was really seen as a novelty of what is this corporate PPA? What are corporates doing in wholesale power markets? But if you fast forward to today, we went from less than 25 companies having these 100% RE commitments, even 2 years after we made ours in 2012, to over 200 companies in 2019 making these commitments and again sending that signal to the market. But we did this because we wanted to have greater impact. Being carbon neutral wasn't enough. And so when we look at what does all this mean for 24/7, we're still trying to have greater impact. And when we dove into in 2017, when we hit 100% RE, what that actually looked like on a more granular level, we actually saw that there was more to do. Because when you look at what you purchase annually, if you look at your global footprint, you might be matched annually for 100%. But hourly, we're still pulling carbon from the grid in certain hours, right? So this bar along the bottom represents load, right? The amount of energy we're taking from the grid. And the green bars represent the energy that we've contracted for in these corporate PPAs. And you'll see that sometimes the green bars are above the load and sometimes they're below. And this hourly kind of zoomed in level really shows that we are still dependent on thermal and carbon resources on the grid. And while you can take everything above that line and fold it over onto the bottom half and really match it, it would all be green 100%. On this hourly level, it's still using these thermal-based resources from the grid. And it's really when we identified this problem that we said there's more that we can do to have greater impact. Looking at this slightly different way, to explain it a different way, here are 4 bars, which represent 4 different hours in which a customer is pulling energy from the grid. The first bar says, okay, the hours where an end consumer hasn't directly purchased for their own energy and they're just relying on the generation makeup of the grid. The black bar represents carbon-based resources. The green is the carbon-free resources naturally occurring on the grid. So in some hours, you're just pulling what's on the grid. The second bar represents an hour where you have contracted. And so now you have the black and green bar, but you also have what you've directly contracted for. So the additional, this is that 100% RE energy on the grid. The third bar actually shows there are certain hours where the wind is really blowing or there's a lot of sun in the middle of the day, and you're actually contracting for more and putting more on the grid than you're actually consuming. And then the last bar looks at, this gets to the 24/7. What we're trying to do, not just on a corporate level, but really on a grid level, is to right-size this and say, we want carbon-free resources on the grid in each hour so that we have a balanced grid and we're not having some hours where we're having excess energy and some hours where we're actually still relying on carbon-based resources. So just to take another look at what we were able to do at our own company, we mapped our own footprint, right? And we said, great, for 4 years, we've been 100% RE annually. But when we break that down hourly, and to do that, you also have to go locally. and look at the grids on which you operate. And certain grids that either have really high wind and solar, which are the most commercially viable resources uh, in the grid, available to them, are really green. You'll also notice that the really green areas where we operate also have really progressive policy that really support either clean energy on the grid or support corporates or end users having customer choice to allow for them to directly procure that clean energy. And those are the ones where we see it greener. Where we see it darker, right, where the hourly profile is either mixed, light green, or even black, is where there are not those naturally occurring resources and or policy isn't supportive. And this really highlights that just being 100% renewable match globally alone doesn't fully work to decarbonize the grids that you operate on. So why are we talking about 24/7 carbon-free energy? It's exactly what I've laid out, which is one, how do we think about this on a more granular hourly level? Two, by looking at it at this level, we are able to improve the grids on which we operate and think more holistically as a system. And three, it's really about focusing on how we're going to displace those high carbon hours where we're dependent on thermal resources, that we're going to truly get to a carbon-free grid, right? Because if we keep doing the same thing and keep making those green hours greener, you're going to become even more reliant on those thermal-based generators when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. How are we going to do that? At least at Google, what we're focusing on is thinking about transactions differently, a combination of technology, and I already alluded to policy that enables end users to really have access to be able to meet such goals. And I'll spend two minutes talking about maybe technologies, transactions, and technologies, and then we'll turn it over to the panel. But just to give an example on the transaction side, what does this actually mean in practice for what an end user would do differently than just signing a corporate PPA? Let's look at our example we have in Chile. So this is a data center we have in Chile. This is a calendar year going from left to right. And then it is a 24-hour day going top to bottom. And so if we look at the Chilean grid, for example, on just that grid, there's hydro on the grid. It's naturally 42% carbon-free if you do nothing. And maybe going back to an earlier chart, this would represent the mix of the black and blue bar in a single hour, right? So when we were first thinking about meeting our 100% RE goal, we did a transaction in Chile, and that was to contract directly for an 80 megawatt solar plant. And what we found is that increased the carbon-free energy on the grid. You can see it clearly by that green band in the middle when solar is operating, up to 75%, which is great. But now when we think about, well, okay, how does 24/7 think about how we do transactions differently? What we're specifically trying to do is fill in the bands that aren't that dark green, right? And so it means right-sizing what we do next. So what we did next is we looked at what combination of wind and solar, which are naturally very good complements to each other, really helps to fill in the most of that, displace the most of the black bars and make them green. And if we could have easily just done another 80 megawatt solar project, which may have made sense for other reasons, it was easier, maybe it was cheaper, but it wouldn't have had the same impact if we weren't thoughtful about what's already on the grid and right size to those hours. And when you do that, you actually find for us, the thing that had the greatest impact to get us then for up to 96% clean energy was another 35 megawatts of solar. So a little bit more solar, but as we already saw, that middle part, that band was pretty green, and 90 megawatts of wind. And so it's thinking about incrementally, what's the next transaction you're going to do to really have the biggest impact to displace the most amount of carbon. So that's an example of, on the transaction side, what you could do. I mentioned technology, and I just want to end by giving one example on the technology side, which is it's not it's not just on the in front of the meter side that we need to think about advancements in technology, right? We can talk a lot about hydrogen and long duration storage and all the advancements we're making in front of the meter. But actually behind the meter, thinking about how technology can play a role in better matching our load demand to the times of day where wind and solar, the most prolific and commercial applications of renewable energy, are producing. And so, at least at Google, we've thought a lot about this, and we've created technology to move load and run our data centers at different times of day. So instead of having a flat profile where we're pulling energy consistently throughout the day, how do we shape how we pull energy into those hours where the sun is shining and the wind is blowing? And so it's actually helping to solve the problem from the back end as well. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that gave a picture about why this is important and what it is, and really turn it over to the panel to discuss what we're going to do next and how we're going to think about this problem as we go to solve it.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for that fascinating presentation and also your leadership in this space. Also, big thanks for getting up so early. I know you're dialing in from the United States this morning for you. I'm now honored to be able to introduce the incredible panel of experts joining Amanda today from across Europe. First of all, we have Henrik Dam, Policy Officer at DG in European Commission. Next, Simone Aconero, who's the Energy Leader and CEO of FlexiDAO. Hannah Hunt, Impact Director at Resource Platform. And last but not least, I have in the studio with me Sebastian de Menten. He's the entrepreneur 24/7 Sustainable Solutions at ENGIE. We're going to kick straight off with some questions. The first one to you, Simone. So why should corporate energy buyers move towards 24/7 energy matching? You heard Amanda's point on it. What's yours?
Yeah, hi, Bruce. Thanks a lot for this question. And first of all, thanks a lot for giving us the opportunity to speak in this such amazing panel. Not easy to go after Amanda, honestly, but let's try. So I believe that it can mainly be summarized in 3 points. I would say, first of all, is maximizing impact, which I think Amanda gave a great overview, managing risks, and also showing leadership. First of all, let's start with impact. Again, incorporating a 24/7 approach to clean energy procurement is the most reliable way to ensure that the procurement of clean energy evolves towards maximizing the decarbonisation impact. It's what Amanda says. It means measuring the real carbon content of the grid where you are, and then eliminate it instead of offset it. That's in a nutshell, I think it's what really comes down to it. But then second of all, I think it's also a great deal of managing risks. The rise of e-fuels and power-to-X is really exposing the misalignment between the physical power reality and how the power market works and how we call something green. So it's really showing this misalignment between the two things. The power market has worked for decades with time frames that are even lower than 1 hour. So it is inevitable that in the next years, future carbon regulations will also change the way we account for emissions and energy. So in a framework in which decarbonisation strategies are defined looking at 2030, not including 24/7 already in this decarbonisation strategy, will make just the gap between what will come and the physical reality of the grid and the accounting greater and greater, which eventually will constitute more risk and cost to actually catch up in the future. And as third, I think it's also going back to a more nice business opportunity. It's about leadership and communicating leadership with transparency and credibility. More and more PPAs are not making the headlines anymore. There are way too many for all of them to make the headline. 24/7 is the new way to show innovation, to show leadership, but to show credibility and transparency. It's saying to consumers, look, I'm willing to showcase that I'm not 100%, but I'm really decarbonizing the grid. And you don't need to be an elite corporate to do that. You don't need to sign a lot of PPAs. You can work with your local suppliers. And as Amanda said, you can look inside. You can look at your energy consumption. You can look at efficiency. There are many things that you can do to start communicating how synchronous you are and to show that you're having an impact. And again, I think very important to highlight, it's important not to shoot for the moon. The majority of the grids where you are not even 40%. Europe is not even 30%. Google, which is one of the most sophisticated, is 60%. Don't be scared to communicate these things, because it's the reality of what we're facing.
Yeah, thanks, Simone. And you know what we heard there was about pushing the boundaries, about impact, about transparency. I mean, coming to you, Hannah. I mean, you manage the resource platform which connects buyers and suppliers, but also does a lot of policy work. I mean, where do you see the benefits, not just for the buyers and suppliers, but also for member states and also other consumers beyond just corporates?
Right. Thank you, Bruce. And absolutely, definitely important to frame our conversation this way. As we see now, today we have a number of companies that are what we can say are setting course for 24/7. Not just Google, others are starting to take steps towards that 24/7 future today. And what we see is that 24/7 starting now, it's a situation of a rising tide lifting all boats. So the efforts to get to 24/7 will not just be, the benefits will not just be felt by companies that pursue it. They certainly will feel those benefits, but the benefits will also be felt by consumers more broadly, by the member states, as you said, Bruce, by the new products and services that are going to be developed to serve 24/7. They will help the larger grid become more resilient, more flexible. It will lead to broader grid digitalization that benefits consumers across the board. Another example, more transparent and more granular trading systems for certificates. That will benefit companies that are directly pursuing 24/7, but also those that are maybe a couple years away from that and are starting to take their first steps to renewable energy procurement. Standards that are synchronized across member states will benefit all member states. And Henrik may speak to this more, but worth saying here too, 24/7 is directly in service of European climate commitments and in alignment with existing legislation. I think it was mentioned in Amanda's presentation earlier that it in itself is encouraging full-scale transformation of electric grids, which member states are working towards right now.
Yeah, great, thanks. We'll come to Henrik for sure in a minute. But first, I mean, I love the analogy of this rising tide lifting all boats. To you, Sebastian, I mean, what's stopping the tide rising? What are the biggest barriers to more widespread adoption of 24/7?
Thank you, Bruce. Excellent question. I would say the first barrier today is awareness on 24/7. And this awareness is in fact recognizing that we are moving from, I would say, a phase 1 in the energy transition for the electricity to a phase 2. And the first phase was about adding renewable capacity as much and as vast as we can to the grid. But now the second phase, once you reach in some countries a level of renewable capacity that is quite high, is to look at the temporality and be sure that the renewable capacity you put on the grid, you can consume it. And it's from moving from buying green to consuming green energy. Once you notice this, you see that you need, as a buyer, you may update your, I would say, your decarbonisation journey from this 1.0, where you were looking at annual accounting on your carbon footprint, to an hourly version. That is 24/7. That's the first barrier. Once you get through this awareness, you will get buyers who need to be able to measure. And so measuring the progress in this 24/7, that's the second barrier. The third barrier is once you get awareness and demand for 24/7 solution, is for suppliers, energy solution providers, midstreamers, to be able to offer 24/7 solution. So it's really a supply question. And maybe on this side, we will need some subsidies for some technologies we want to be able to push. And finally, the last one is about updating the systems. The system of guarantees of origin, the exchange system, the metering system, all the systems that would allow to scale these 24/7 strategies.
Thanks, Sebastian. And from Eurelectric's perspective, we are working closely with, well, first the resource platform, Hannah and her team, with the energy tag to push on those barriers. Initially, the awareness issue is key, but then, of course, on the advocacy, providing enabling frameworks, as Amanda put it. Let's dive a bit into the more technical detail now. And Amanda, following on from your presentation, is any progress towards hourly procurement good? Regardless of how you measure it, is any progress good, or how do you see that from Google's perspective?
Well, 100%. Anything that any corporation or anyone is doing to help put clean and renewable energy onto the grid absolutely is good, right? And as Hannah mentioned, different customers are on different parts of the journey to get there, right? And we don't want to in any way say, stop doing what you're doing, right? But what we are saying is, let's think about what we're doing in the picture of the grid, and let's make sure we're thinking about the whole grid and how we're thinking about this to really have the biggest impact. So the short answer to your question is yeah, anything is good. I think when we think about this, though, and the next evolution and how we get there, there are going to need to be ways that we think about this together and think about how do we standardize, what does this mean, and make it less complicated so it is an easier goal for people to achieve and contemplate as well.
Yeah, great. We'd fully support that, obviously. And now, in my introduction, I mentioned the ambition now to move to 55% carbon emission reductions in Europe. Simone, coming back to you, how do you see 24/7 matching help move us towards that 55% goal, especially over the next 10 years? This is a short time window we have. How can we see that this 24/7 move the needle towards that?
It is short. It seems long, but it isn't. No, it's a great question, because I think we touched upon it slightly, but essentially, again, I think that the great power of 24/7 is ensuring that end consumer investments are aligned with bringing closer consumption and production. In the end, it comes down to that. Recently, I've read that Bloomberg, New Energy Finance, forecast that there are, I think now, 285 companies that are part of RE100 will collectively purchase around 270 terawatt hours of energy by 2030, which means 93 gigawatts of new capacity going online. This is, of course, not only Europe. So, but again, this is buying or installing capacity. This is what Sebastian was calling phase one. There's another side of the coin, which is phase two, which is bringing consumption closer to it. Right now, there's no really a business case for what Amanda showed in her slide. Like, Google is doing it because it's a leader, but adapting my load curve to the availability of renewable energy so that I reduce my carbon emissions, there's no business case for it currently, as we report, as we account, as policies are made, as carbon credits work. So we need 24/7 to create this business case. The moment that we report hourly, that we exchange hourly certificates, that we buy hourly, suddenly we have a business case for load flexibility, for storage, for power to X, etc. It's really, this is how 24/7 can help achieving the 55%. Creating a benefit and a business case and price signals for consumers to care when they consume, and to do so to match renewable carbon-free energy.
Yeah, very good. As you say, it's a journey, and we're starting the journey. But what's clear is that the corporate sourcing journey started some time ago, and this phase one, phase two. In no way do we want to undermine the great work that's going on in that phase one. That should continue and even accelerate. The PPA revolution as it is.
Absolutely.
Say, too many to count. Should continue and pick up pace. So now to Henrik, representing the European Commission, you've heard a lot of comments there about policy frameworks, enablers, and so on. Put you on the spot here. What is the European Commission doing to enable 24/7 renewable electricity matching?
Yeah, thanks for that introduction and all the interesting presentations. And we do want 24/7 renewable energy. And a main prerequisite for that is that we need more renewables, first and foremost. And this is exactly what the Commission is doing by both pushing and promoting and establishing good framework conditions for investments in producing renewable energy. Then we need also to look at the user side, and in particular to have more electrification, and in particular from those sectors that are flexible and have a flexible demand. That could, for instance, be such as electromobility and also heating, that can be able to take gaps or take peaks of electricity when they are there, so that also the more demanding sectors can chip in when there is scarcely renewable electricity. And then, of course, well, we need an EU market for electricity. This is already very well on the way, but it will be even more important if we want this 100% 24/7 renewable energy supply. We need to have seamless exchange across borders, because also the situation, and that's the benefit of Europe being such a large region, believe it or not, wind is always blowing somewhere in Europe, or the sun is shining, or some water is running the right place. And if it's not, well, then at least we have some flexibility from perhaps some of the other sectors. So these are some of the main elements that we want to promote. So more renewables, a better market, and introducing also the more flexible sectors with flexible demand.
Thanks, Henrik. Thanks. So the path to 24/7 carbon-free energy procurement will require multiple building blocks, as we've just heard, to allow for development of this enhanced procurement strategy. Of these, there are 3 that Eurelectric and Resource Task Force have identified, where we believe there are barriers or gaps that need to be addressed. We're going to touch on 3 of them now. The first one is flexibility. One challenge is ensuring there is enough renewable electricity supply, as mentioned by Henrik, to meet the hourly buyer demand that may be fixed or variable in nature. But suppliers and buyers must also develop, agree, and deploy significant flexibility solutions, including storage, demand-side management, and grid infrastructure technologies to meet temporality, additionality, and regionality needs that we've all just touched upon. So, Hannah, coming to you on flexibility. So the flexibility services and products that are going to be needed, what is available in the market? You know, what have you seen that's already existing?
Right, no, thanks for that. Great setting the scene for flexibility. And right, this is the challenge. And we're speaking here of buyer demand that is being met by specific projects, right? We're talking about the buyer being linked either physically or virtually to these projects. So you're matching demand and supply, but you're also working to have that added impact layer there. So how do you achieve this? Your question. So agreeing on flexibility solutions, suppliers and buyers working together on those. To start, I mean, the buyer demand should be well understood, efficient, flexible. It begins with understanding your load, assessing it in a detailed manner, moving on to solutions you were mentioning like storage and demand-side management, but then going back to having that access to grid-level technologies and protocols, the transparent certificate systems, transparent detailed trading systems. So in many cases, again, going back to the steps you can take today, we are talking about developing, enhancing existing services and products in terms of what's available. Amanda, again, you mentioned the example of the sort of carbon intelligent load shifting that's possible on the buyer side to shift demand to when renewable production is happening. Even when you're just thinking about data tracking of consumption and production, there's examples of Microsoft and Vattenfall working together to implement a 24/7 hourly monitoring solution. In the US, Iron Mountain has been working to develop hourly load tracking for its data center. So there are more and more examples coming up here. With storage, battery storage is being proven out as a commercial solution for years now. Renewable hydrogen, we're finding, is becoming more and more competitive for certain use cases. So will be a solution for this decade. And that's just to start. We certainly will have more that needs to be done, but ready to take steps today.
Yeah, and any comment on what actually needs to be done going forward? I mean, some great examples there, but pick out one thing that could be done today to help that flexibility solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. I would look to actually the market you mentioned, energy tag there, Bruce, in the introduction. Looking towards more demonstrator projects where buyers and suppliers are working together, and doing more to assess. I mentioned earlier, load assessment, being able to accurately match that up with specific projects you could contract with, saying, what can you do today by combining wind and solar, for example, and then perhaps down the road adding a storage solution, and then developing from there on out. Sort of more granular is probably the direction that needs to be gone in, moving from annual to monthly down to ideally hourly tracking and certification.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, and we're going to move on now to, in my introduction to the flexibility, I mentioned additionality. Now, that's a word that's firstly not very well understood and certainly not well defined. Sebastian, to you, difficult question for you. What is additionality in your understanding?
Yes.
And is it important?
Yeah, Bruce, it's very important. Additionality measure the impact you have on your carbon footprint. But additionality, it's a gray area, as you said, Bruce. It's not black, white, or we say green or gray. There are different shades of additionality. To understand it, I would say the strongest form of additionality is when a buyer builds on his own side a new renewable asset. He owns the land, he finances the asset, he does everything by himself. So clearly, the impact of this action is due to the buyer. Now you may also enter into a PPA where, thanks to your transaction, thanks to the PPA you're signing, you're making the project happen. So it's really your decision to enter into a PPA that brings the right financing for the project to happen. But that's not only, I would say that's the usual additionality, but you can think further on additionality. For instance, if you take an existing asset, like a battery, a storage, and you start operating the storage differently in order to reach a higher 24/7 and a higher carbon impact. That's also additionality, because you take an existing asset and you change the way you operate. It can be your own load, it can be a battery, it can be a biomass power plant. So that's also additionality, whenever you can measure the impact. And I would go further. You can, for instance, if a buyer signed a PPA for an asset that has been already contracted by the suppliers upstream. So he's not really creating a new asset thanks to his decision, but he is freeing the midstreamer or the supplier from a long position. And by doing so, it allows the supplier to go even further and support new projects. And there is also other shades of additionality, but the important thing is really thinking about impact and being creative into finding solution that creates impact.
Okay, and you mentioned midstreamer. I mean, energy, I assume, is what you'd term a midstreamer. What's your role? I mean, for the other panelists, I think, Hannah's role in resource pretty clear, Henrik's very clear. Google, we've had Amanda's presentation, so that's clear. I'll come on to Simone in a minute to find out what his role is. But you're, as energy, as a midstreamer, what's your role in this, the 24/7?
So as a midstreamer, first, we need, I would say, to be able to support the buyer into its decision, to advise him to find solution for his case, for his decarbonisation journey. That's first, advising. The second one is supplying solution, 24/7 solution. As an example, we have Theo, the Energy Origin, which is a startup providing traceability of the electricity on a 24/7 basis, on the blockchain, auditable. So that's typically a solution that can be brought to the client to support his 24/7 journey. Also, the midstreamer, we aim to provide liquidity to this solution. What I mean by liquidity is that sometimes the buyer's decision timing is not the same as the producer, the generator, or the battery investor. So if you want to align both decisions, it's quite complex. And sometimes we play the role of a buffer. So we take upstream position, or we already contract new assets, and then we provide them to the client. So to fix this timing issue. And obviously, at the end, we also play a role in the regulation. We bring our expertise to improve regulation and to make it more efficient.
Okay, thanks. So now we're going to go back to what I said at the beginning, which is about increasing renewable supply, but also the flexibility. And to you, Henrik, what can be done for 24/7 renewable energy supply within the upcoming implementation of RED II, the Renewable Energy Directive?
Yes, thank you. And this is exactly upcoming, and the member states will need to implement in their national legislation all the initiatives from the second Renewables Directive by 1st of July this year. And all member states are very busy in doing so. And that, for instance, includes, as an important element, a mandatory requirement to use the guarantees of origin when suppliers are disclosing renewable electricity to their consumers. Well, this is, of course, based on the annual or monthly claims and the production schedules that is available there on the GOs. But we also, in the context of having this more harmonized framework for guarantees of origin, there is work going on in the standardization with the so-called 16325 standard, where, in fact, already now a field is reserved for the more precise timestamp. So this would mean that for the suppliers that really want to document this hourly or even sub-hourly matching, well, there will be certificates available to document this. We would still need to see how many will use it, but for sure there is already some both producers and users that are able to take on board this requirement, and therefore I also welcome initiatives like one from ENGIE, and we are indeed providing the tools to certify such claims.
Okay, thanks, Henry. We're going to move on in the interest of time to the second building block, which is data. Now, there are different types of data needed for hourly matching, from the buyer, metering data, on-site generation, and from the grid, real-time generation mix and forecasted grid mix. So to you first, Simone, what's the current status of the different data sets needed for 24/7 procurement, and what can we expect in the coming years?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. That's a great question. I think that overall it helps to break down and to define these different data sets that are needed for 24/7. I think that overall we can see two groups. One is the public data and private data. Public data includes long but also short-term forecasts of the grid carbon content, market volumes, imports, exports, consumption, production. This is essentially what then enables to map the carbon content of the grid. In Europe, I think that there's a great deal of work that is already being done by ENTSO-E, TSOs, grid operators, but also private companies. Electricity Map is a great example that provide accurate carbon mapping in data in Europe. I also think, and this is my personal opinion as a service provider serving the market, that the availability of public data is actually ahead of the demand of the customers for it when it comes to this kind of data. And then there's the second part, which is the private data. Private data is essentially metering, so the consumption and the production. Here, I believe, and again, as a company that works on a daily basis with the kind of data set, that the energy sector is lagging behind compared to other industries. It is true that Europe is a front runner when it comes to smart meter penetration. It is currently increasing, but still this data ends up being siloed in thousands, like literally thousands of grid operators databases that Europe has. too many times buyers, as of today, end up relying on self-installed devices. So because it's so hard to access this data, that it's better to install my own. And this is not the best way to go forward. So really what 24/7 needs is, because metering data is a cornerstone of 24/7, is that this data is made available in a secure, because privacy is always a fundamental piece of all of this conversation, but it has to be made in a secure, ensuring privacy, but very important, agile and no discriminatory way. Because these only access to data that meets these parameters will then allow for new services and innovations that will eventually make the life easier for consumers to, like Hannah was saying, map your loads, understand what a PPA profile really is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So both for the famous phase one that needs to go ahead and the phase two that needs to start, having access to this data is fundamental. And here there's a lot of work also being done, which goes ahead of making a standardized access to data. Here the main initiative is the Data Bridge Alliance, which is pushed by a set of TSOs in Europe, and many other initiatives for BSOs, etc. But really a European data hub for private data would be a true game changer to develop and foster innovation in Europe, thinking of 24/7, but not only.
Yeah, absolutely, not only. And the phase two we're referring to, I mean, it cannot happen without digitalization, and for that, as you say, we need the access to the data. So we're going to come back to you, Henrik, now, and move on to. There was a comment from Sebastian about blockchain, and there was a comment there about platforms. I mean, how do you see the ongoing pilots for 24/7 renewable supply with technologies such as blockchain and the platform issue? How do you see that?
Well, I see them as very much welcomed, and we want to encourage this to continue to gain and to learn experiences and to help building the market. We can see several of those, and you have already some of them represented here in your panel today. But I think it's also important that, well, if we have a lot of these platforms, that at a certain stage, we need to have convergence, or at least some sort of recognition and exchange. We need some sort of regulated monopoly in order to avoid double disclosure of the same renewable energy content, and to build the consumers' trust in this. Because, as I said, we need a European solution to this, which also means that at a certain stage, these proprietary solutions will need to develop into something that could be used in a wider European context. And this also applies for blockchain, because, well, this is a very useful tool, but there are also many different ways of doing blockchain. It's just an IT app that you can use, and it needs some governance that will enable this to build. And this could, for instance, happen also in the context of some further standardization work that will be on its way soon. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I mean, referring to that, and also back to what Simone said about the energy sector's level of development in the data space. I mean, at Eurelectric, we tend to agree, and we've launched a platform, the Beyond Digital platform, to explore those technologies, both data digitalization, but AI and blockchain, to push forward that and engage utilities with other stakeholders, such as Google and Microsoft and other tech firms. So that's something we're trying to push forward. The final building block is on measurement and metrics, and it seems clear that we will need agreed metrics to measure company progress towards 24/7, as well as methodologies to define these metrics, principles, assumptions, and criteria. Amanda, coming back to you, and you mentioned some of the ways you were measuring it, but how is Google measuring your progress towards 24/7, and how did you come up with that methodology?
Yep, thanks. And I look forward to answering that question, but I have to say it's been really interesting listening to this panel and all the insights. I wanted to go back actually to one thing. Simone talked about really making the business case, right, of this for end users, and then having everyone touch on it. I think that's really the most important thing, right? We really want the industry to go here, and we don't want to do it alone because we alone can't solve this, right? And in order to do this, Henrik spoke on the guarantees of origin. As long as they're annual, we're not going to be able to have the standards and metrics to incentivize end users to be more flexible, to load shift to certain hours, or even understand how to be measured against that, right? Or which hours to move to. And so I think this whole conversation is really important in making sure that we reduce complexity, that we figure out the right standardized approach so that it's easy for others to do and adapt, and they can make the business case, internally of why this makes sense for the business and how to do it easily. But now to answer your question, sorry, at Google, we think about it really measuring it in two ways. One is looking at our annual carbon-free hourly footprint score. And that's a score that looks at, okay, in each hour, how much carbon-free resource is on the grid, and then how much additional are we putting on the grid, and really scoring that on an hourly basis, right, to see our progress there. That's the first metric. I think the second one is one we look at when deciding between what to do next, and that's really looking at avoided emissions, right? So not all carbon hours are the same, right? Some hours, some resources, coal, for example, emits much more carbon than gas and other resources. So we actually look at the carbon intensity in that hour. What resource are we displacing? And when deciding, we should do all of it, right? But when deciding how do we have the biggest impact, right, we're really looking at displacing the most carbon first. So that's the second metrics we look at. And I have to say, go to sustainability.google. There's a white paper free to anyone that goes into granular detail on all of these metrics, so we can be very transparent so others can see and understand how we're doing, and we can share that information, which I won't get into here because of time.
No, but that's a great white paper. I've read it myself, Amanda. I love it, and anybody who's interested in that topic should definitely read that. I mean, your words about maximizing decarbonisation, I think that's, the key here, and having impact. And it's not just about, 100% renewables. It's going beyond that and really focusing on the carbon intensity of the grid, how we take that down. So Simone, to you, what's your view of measurement and metrics? You're involved in that business, and as you rightly pointed out, and Amanda picked up, the business case. Is there a way to structure that, the measurement and metrics to enable business cases to take effect?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we could do a panel only on this, as Amanda said. So as a service provider, essentially what we do is that we provide technology and advisory to companies that want to go beyond its Scope 2 reporting. Scope 2 reporting is what companies do to disclose the carbon content of their electricity consumption. So I think that it's very important that we need to acknowledge the great deal that the current system has achieved. And we don't want, as we said many times, to convey the wrong message. We don't want to say that annual accounting is wrong. That's by no means what we want to do. So as FlexiDAO, the metrics and measurement that we implement is actually try to make the two systems coexist in the short term. So continue with your Scope 2, continue with your efforts, but you can start looking. You can start understanding better your load. You can start understanding better how your load meets the current needs of the grid. And also, as another thing that we're doing related to measuring metrics, of course, then the certification of the claim that a consumer says. And this, it links very much to what Henrik says, that I truly believe that even though as a service provider, together with Theo, we push forward certain solutions, we've always done our best to do it in the way that is most compliant to the existing regulation. And already we are working within the concept of energy tag with issuing bodies in Europe today. So we believe that it's extremely important, as Henrik said, that the technology that we showcase is then adopted, and that in Europe we can create a framework in which multiple companies can trustedly, reliably make claims on 24/7 procurement that sit together with what reporting standard and accounting standard claim. At the same time, it's true, as Amanda said, that as long as we maintain a dual narrative in which you can report annually and only voluntarily you can report hourly, it's inevitable that buyers will not have as many incentives. If I can claim 0 emissions on an annual basis through market-based Scope 2 emissions, I have less incentives to care for 24/7. So it's a balance that we're trying to find a service provider to work within the current system, not conveying any negative message on how to disrupt it, but to grow all together towards, as Sebastian liked it a lot, buying renewable energy to consume renewable energy. And do so, not saying that what is being done is wrong, but working all together as technology provider, buyers, providers, regulators, to create the right framework from Europe to then be exported outside, because I really believe that we have the right opportunity for Europe to be a leader, even more than it actually is here. And already international standards like IREC are adopting and welcoming platforms like us to work on their standards. We are being whitelisted by IREC to offer temporal granularity. We would like to do that with every single issuing body that sits in Europe, because we recognize the importance of monopoly. At the same time, new incentives, as Google said, are needed. So really striking the balance, working within the current system to improve it with the goal of decarbonizing the grid, I think is really what we're trying to do, and how we structure all the metrics and measurements, how to put together these two worlds so that they can grow together.
Yeah, good, very good. And I mean, well, first of all, you've answered my next question, which was about the critical next steps. I think you summarized some of those very, very well, and I especially like the collaboration aspect of it. I mean, time's running out. We've just got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to go to the other 4 panelists now and give them the opportunity to answer that question about critical next steps. Hannah, we're going to start with you. Just keep it short, but what do you think we should do next?
Sure. One, continue to raise awareness. I know that's what we're trying to do, is resourcing your electric with the 24/7 task force. And then in short, create that enabling framework in Europe for 24/7. Henrik, it's great to hear the push through RED 2 for the more harmonized network for guarantees of origin. Making sure that that framework allows for more granular information, allows for all renewable energy producers to receive GOs. Creating that framework is what's going to allow what's happening right now in the market to grow and to turn into things like standards and procedures that can be adopted across Europe.
Perfect. Thanks, Hannah. Over to you, Sebastian. Please keep it short. What's the next critical step?
Yes, I would say for buyers to start updating the journey to 2.0, but still pushing hard on 1.0.
Great. Thanks. We're going to have to put on our website what 1.0 and 2.0 is, but I think that could be important to clarify exactly those two. Henrik, you got some supporters in the panel, myself as well, about what you've been saying, but what's the critical next step, either for yourself or for us as the market players?
Well, I think there are very good elements in all of it. Well, a very concrete step I think will be needed is some experiments with a true cross-border market and matching of those guarantees of origin that will be issued with a more precise timestamp, because, well, this is still not existing, and we would need to have it at a truly European scale in order to have a 100% matching of renewable supply.
Fantastic, Henrik. Fantastic ambition, and thank you so much for joining us. Last but not least, we're going to go back to Amanda, back to the beginning. And Amanda, what do you see as the critical next steps for the 24/7?
Yeah, thank you. I think I would echo what all my fellow panelists would say. I think from the buyer's perspective, in order for us to think about this part of the journey, we've got to, I've been saying this all along, we've got to make it less complicated. We got to make it simple for users. And I also want to send a message to the industry that provides supply, right, is if you can find solutions that can do this for us where we don't have to directly get involved and we can work with our intermediate providers to do this, that will also help enable more to do it, right? Because as end customers, we want the system to deliver carbon-free energy in every hour.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Amanda. And as Eurelectric, you can believe that we are committed to pushing many of those next steps through a lot of our working groups, platforms, and as Hannah mentioned, the task force on 24/7. It leaves me to stop there and thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having these panelists today and discussing 24/7. We look forward to those next steps. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.